Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. This is a collaborative event with Herut Canada and Regavim with our amazing special guest, Naomi Kahn, and we are privileged to have her here. I have a bit of a bio. Let me introduce her. Naomi Linder Kahn received degrees in political science and Near Eastern languages and literatures from New York University. She served as director of the Schools of Judaic Studies and of Education at Lander Institute of Jerusalem and is a well-known editor and translator. Mrs. Kahn is the director of the International Division at Regavim, a research-based think tank and lobbying group dedicated to the protection and preservation of Israel's sovereignty. Together with her husband, Ari, she's raised 5 children in Givat Ze'ev, where they have lived for over 35 years. And we are privileged to have her here today. The topic, as you know, is about apartheid in Israel. It's real and it's against the Jews. Naomi, why don't you take it away? Please, everyone, post questions and comments in the chat, and we will try to get to all of them afterwards. Go ahead, Naomi. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for challenging me to address this really challenging topic. I'm thrilled to be here, not only because we can't travel anywhere at the moment, so this is the closest I'm going to get to a visit abroad, but also because you can't be involved with anything with Lauren and not be infected by that enthusiasm, and that so it's just amazing and energizing. So thank you very much. And let me just start off by saying what tonight's talk is going to be and what it's not going to be. I'm not going to discuss the history of apartheid. I'm not going to discuss South African apartheid. I'm not going to discuss the underpinnings of the entire concept of a nation state, whether or not that is in and of itself an apartheid or racist concept. I would just point out that recently the cat has come out of the bag. So organizations like B'Tselem and Peace Now have abandoned discussing the difference between Judea and Samaria and Israel proper in their lingo. And they have come to the obvious statement out loud of what they have always believed, and that is that the very concept of a Jewish nation state is ipso facto racist because it favors Jewish rights. I do not subscribe to that position. I don't believe that it is a necessary conclusion of any liberal thinking. I would also point out that nation states exist all over the world that do favor one nation's rights over others. So I'm going to take it as a basis that we have a right to a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state with Jewish sovereignty, and that automatically we protect Jewish national interests, while at the same time being a democracy that protects the rights of minorities and non-Jews who live within our borders. So anyone who has issue with any of those topics, I'd be happy to debate you on another platform. But that I'm coming from a place which I hope most of you will be able to understand that the underpinnings of the whole conversation are that Israel is a Jewish democratic state, and we have a right to be so. On the other hand, there is a question that we hear all the time in the press nowadays. Is there apartheid in Israel? Israel is an apartheid state. Israel is essentially enforcing 2 different sets of laws or treating different populations differently under the law. Is that apartheid? Well, you can call it what you want. Racist, yes. Anti-Semitic, yes. And then you'll ask, okay, so which Semites in this equation are actually suffering from this? And I'm here to tell you this evening that it's not what the press often states, that it's not the Jewish state of Israel oppressing or mistreating or denying rights to non-Jewish residents of this territory, but quite the opposite. Israeli courts, Israeli legislation, Israeli decisions are actually severely discriminating against Jews and their rights, particularly land rights, in the state of Israel in the 21st century. This is very hard to believe, but it is very, very easy to prove. And I'd like to show you some examples of that this evening. So I'm going to share a presentation that I put together just to make things a little bit easier to track. We're going to start with a very brief, I hope, history lesson. If I become too embroiled in the history, somebody just go like this and I'll stop and we'll move forward. But without understanding the history of how the situation, the legal situation in which we're operating came to exist, we'll have a hard time understanding how we have arrived at where we are today. So I'm going to share my screen now, and let's hope that it works. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. Yes, I'm going to scroll up to the first slide, and here we are. Are you seeing my screen? Good. Okay, so again, the topic of tonight's talk is apartheid in Israel, not what you think. I'm going to start with 3 sentences about Regavim, the organization I work for, I'm a part of, and I invite all of you to become a part of it as well. It is actually not, it is a public movement here in Israel. We are dedicated to protecting Israel's national resources, most specifically land resources, because that is the most basic resource of the Jewish people, the land itself, and everything else really it derives from there, because the decision about the land itself, who uses it and to what purpose, really is the most basic expression of a nation's sovereignty. So how we do what we do is essentially through fieldwork, research, and legal activity. We go out into the field, we divide the country up into regions, we have field coordinators who go out every day, see what's happening on the ground, take all that information back, research who's doing what and with what permission, and then try to figure out what can be done about it in cases where the land resources and other resources of the land of Israel are being misused. We also take another step back and look at the larger picture, not just incidents, but any patterns that emerge. Is this a systematic use of the resource? Are there holes in the legislation or government policy that have to be addressed? And we help take that to the next level and work very closely with members of the Knesset and the government itself in order to fill the gaps where the law is lacking. And as we go through the history now, you'll understand why the law is lacking in many instances. So let's take a stroll down memory lane. We'll go back 150 years even, although we could go back much further than that. We can go back 700 years and still talk about the Ottoman Empire. I'm just going to remove that from your screen. Sorry. So this is essentially a map of the Ottoman Empire in its various stages. And if you look carefully, you will be able to find the piece of land that we're talking about today. It's very small, but it's here. And compared to the other countries that were involved, again, during the height of the Ottoman Empire, this was a massive, let's say, jurisdictional unit. And it was administered centrally. The Sultan, the supreme ruler of this empire, essentially owned half the world. And he alone decided who could do what with the land. So that was the basic underlying principle of Ottoman land law. Again, Ottoman land law being based essentially on Sharia law, which is Muslim law. The Ottoman Empire had its ups and downs, mostly downs, and as you know, eventually fell to pieces. Before it did, it began when the first and second Aliyah began to change the map or the value of land in the land of Israel. The Ottoman Empire began to issue land deeds called kushan, which registered in a very anecdotal sort of way who the Sultan decided would use each area. Take into account again that the land of Israel was more or less barren. There was almost no one here. It was a wasteland, largely uninhabited, You can read Mark Twain's account of his travels through this part of the world, or other travelers who said they would travel for 3 days at a time and not see one human being. It was barren and desolate. When the Jews began to arrive in the land of Israel in the 1800s, an economy began to develop, and land began to have some sort of value. So the Sultan would set aside land use privileges to the Mukhtar, the head of a particular village that was forming, and he would write down more or less the boundaries of the land that was allowed to be used. Things like from the tree or from the line of 3 trees to the place where Muhammad ties up his donkey, meaning there was no organized system, no cadastre system, which is used everywhere else in the world. And this was the way land use was recorded. If you didn't use the land that the Sultan set aside for you for a certain amount of time, it automatically reverted back to the ownership of the Sultan, because everything belonged to the Sultan, and he just gave people permission to use it. So this is how things progressed until the late 19th century, when Jewish immigration began to change the situation. And you can see here that the Turkish soldiers became involved in enforcing the law here. There were all sorts of land disputes because the system was so inefficient and outmoded that it was eventually abandoned. In 1913, the Turkish Empire realized that its system of recording land use and land ownership was inefficient, and they began to reform it. They threw out the existing Ottoman land law and began to work on something to replace it, but didn't have time. By the time the First World War broke out, a new system had not been instituted, and the system was essentially frozen in amber. And this area, of course, the entire holdings of what had remained of the Ottoman Empire, was divided up among the victorious powers for administration until such time as independent states, nation states essentially, could be established in these territories. Here's where things get a little bit tricky, or even trickier than they were. The British, as we all know, were placed in charge of quite a big chunk of territory here. They were both this red area, all of this, which was the mandate for Palestine, and this as well, a British mandate for what eventually became Iraq. This was a French mandate, and so on and so on. The areas were divided up among the victorious powers for administration only. One of the principles of a mandatory power is that the borders that were assigned to these territories could not be legally changed by anyone other than the League of Nations / United Nations. So the British took this area and did precisely that. They changed the borders and lopped off 80% and created Jordan, and left 20 odd percent, just under 20%, to remain at the disposal of the Jewish community for the establishment of an independent Jewish state. So all of that was well and good, or not, but that was the situation, and the Jewish community was notorious, let's say, for making do with what they were given. And as a matter of fact, in 1947, when the United Nations suggested redividing this for a second attempt at a two-state solution, the Jewish community agreed, even though those borders would have been untenable. But the Arabs rejected that further repartition of the area. But again, the mandate ended in 1948, and the map that should have resulted was this. Everything to the west of the Jordan River was set aside for the Jewish state. All of the east was set aside for a Palestinian Arab state, right? This is the first two-state solution, and Transjordan soon became known as Jordan, And this was what the map was supposed to look like. But as we all know, it did not end up that way because the Arabs declared war and Jordan illegally occupied territory to the west of the Jordan River, changed the name that had always been used in all international parlance, in all international treaties, in the League of Nations Charter, in the United Nations Charter, in the British Mandate, removed the names Judea and Samaria, and added this new name to justify their occupation of the territory, calling it the West Bank, which is why we try to avoid using that terminology, because it simply justifies an illegal occupation and eventual annexation of territory that was set aside to always have been part of the state of Israel, or the Jewish homeland, if you want to be technical. So this is what the map looked like for 19 years, from 1948 until 1967. The Jordanians annexed this territory. That annexation was never recognized. It was actually condemned universally by the United Nations, all member states of the Arab League, as a matter of fact. Other than 2 countries, no one ever recognized the legality or legitimacy of Jordanian occupation, annexation, or presence at all of any territory west of the Jordan. Those 2 countries were, number 1, the country that created Jordan to begin with, which was the United Kingdom, and number 2, Pakistan. That's what it was. So the occupation of this area was illegal. Nonetheless, the Jordanians extended Jordanian law to this territory. And that is a crucial issue for everything that we're going to discuss going forward. This is what the map looked like as of June. This map was created and reconfirmed on June 10th, 1967, right after the Six-Day War. And you'll notice that the repatriated territory is not painted the same color as the rest of the land of Israel. And that is simply because the state of Israel decided not to extend its law or to declare its sovereignty on this area. I'm stressing, Israel could not annex this territory for the simple reason that you cannot annex something that already belongs to you. You cannot annex territory for which there is no other sovereign recognized in international law. So the whole talk of annexation here is a misnomer, but Israel decided that it would negotiate the status of the people living in this territory, not the territory itself, because it could not do so, but the status of the people, the non-Jewish population living in this territory, and therefore would refrain from extending Israel's law or declaring its repatriation of this territory and leave it open for negotiation. And therein lies the rub, as they say. So again, this is what the map looks like to this day. This area has a color of its own, and it has a tremendous mess of layers of law because Israeli law was never extended to this area. Starting in 1995 and the Oslo Accords and later the Y Plantation Agreement, other types of power sharing have been instituted, but that is less a concern for us today. That's a topic for another conversation. So the law that is in force, the law that we would have to examine in order to discuss whether or not there is apartheid being practiced in this territory, is essentially made up of the vestiges of all of those changes that happened since the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in 1917. Again, going backwards, Ottoman land law, which is based on Sharia law, British mandatory law, followed by Jordanian law, despite the illegality of the occupation and annexation, and now military law, which has been instituted by the State of Israel since 1967. So imagine again that we're talking about doing what's best for all the people living in this territory. And I'm not talking only about the Jewish people. I'm not talking about the future of the state of Israel. I'm talking about people who were physically living in the areas repatriated to Israel in June 1967. And look at this list of law, and you think for a moment, does it make any sense that people should be living under a combination of law that was abandoned over 100 years ago by the people who created it, by law instituted as a stopgap measure by a temporary caretaker, as law that was instituted by an illegal occupier that was never recognized by the nations of the world, also based on Sharia law, and finally, military law that generally confines itself to keeping the peace and security. Obviously, there are going to be massive holes in the system because of the combination of laws that are in force. And it would be to the best interest of everyone involved if there were one clear, modern, Western system of law enforced. Unfortunately, the state of Israel continues to refrain from extending Israeli law, which is considered worldwide, not just by the people who live here, but worldwide considered a very sound, progressive, extremely reasonable system of law. But Israel, because of international pressure at this point, is refraining from doing that. And everyone living here and in Israel, Little Israel, as we call it, is suffering the consequences of that failure. And we call it cowardice. It's a failure. So we operate presently under this strange web of law, layers of law, and we try to make the best of it. It's extremely complex to understand most of it. There are very, very few people who really have a handle on how all these four systems fit together. There are a few experts in the world on each of the four systems, but very few who are expert in the way these four systems come together or collide. And thank God, I work with quite a few of those experts who actually do exist. So let's have a look at some of the things that result from this strange web of laws. Somebody's not on mute and it's making a very weird sound. Okay. Unfortunately, none of these things have ever been translated, but what you're looking at here is one of the Jordanian laws that is still in force and is enforced by the Supreme Court of the State of Israel. This is the thing that's going to blow your mind, because this says that it is illegal to sell land, even to rent land, but to give any property rights of any kind to non-Arabs in Judea and Samaria. This is true in Jordan. Jordan, I would remind you, is a state that was created by the United Nations and is also the only place in the world where there are specific anti-Semitic laws that maintain the status of Jordan as Judenrein, free of Jews. Jews are prohibited from owning property or businesses in Jordan. And because Jordan annexed the territory, Judea and Samaria, they are equally prohibited in Judea and Samaria. So the place I'm sitting in right now, my house in Givat Ze'ev, although the land was purchased by a Jewish family, by the head of the Angel dynasty, Solomon Angel, in 1918, and we have all the deeds for it, we are actually prohibited from, under the current set of laws, from buying and selling this land as private Jewish individuals. And the Supreme Court of the State of Israel and all the other courts that flow from that jurisdiction enforce this law. Private Jews cannot own property in Judea and Samaria. So a few years ago, because of the absolute absurdity of this law, the State of Israel, rather than abolishing the law, rather than changing the law, has found ways to work around it, but has left this law on the books and continues to enforce it. This is apartheid. This is what apartheid looks like. And no one actually discusses the fact that there are on the books and enforced by the government of the Jewish state laws that clearly discriminate against Jews and their rights, their most basic rights. One of the most basic rights recognized by the international community is the right to own property. And here you have it. And this is still on the books and is still enforced. Let's have another look. I will show you all of these things. None of them have ever been translated, but I'll give you a list of some of the more egregious instances of apartheid law against Jews that are not only on the books, but are enforced every single day in Judea and Samaria. One of them is called Tzav Shimush Mafriach. That means that if there is a dispute between an Arab and a Jewish claimant about land ownership in Judea and Samaria, there is a military order that will prevent the Jews from using the land or entering the land, setting foot on the property, even if they have had rights to that property and have been using that property for a decade or more. The military government can issue a legislative order barring them from that land. This is only against Jews. There is no such military order against Arabs. There's another legislative order, a military order called Tzav Tichum, where the military can set an entire area off limits to Jews only. It has been used only against Jews. It actually doesn't state that in the law, but has never been applied to non-Jews. So if, for example, a new community is being built and an Arab claims that it is on his or her land, his land essentially, because women, that's another story. Women can't really be in the picture here. They don't have any rights under Sharia law. But if an Arab claims that the Jewish community is being built on his land, without ever having to prove it, the military will execute an order setting the entire area off limits to Jews. This is still on the books and still enforced today, and it is clearly an apartheid, racist, anti-Semitic law, or use of the law. Then there's the real kicker, and this one has cost the state of Israel hundreds of thousands of dunams of state land in the past decade. We have a full study on the amount of land that has been stolen from the state of Israel and the Jewish people in this way. It's called The Roots of Evil. It's a study of the use of agricultural projects to lay claim to land. Now, stepping back a minute, I'll give you the background. Article 78 of the Ottoman land law, the Ottoman land code, states that if you use a piece of land for a certain amount of time, the Sultan can give you rights to that land, whether or not you have any ownership of it. The idea behind this was to encourage people to do something with the wasteland that was the land of Israel at the time. The Sultan wanted people to plant things, to grow things, to develop an economy, to develop agriculture. And the way he did that was essentially by giving land away for free, giving people rights to land without them having to prove it, to purchase it, to do anything to it, in order to encourage people to actually do something with the fallow, barren land of Israel. This law clearly is not a logical use of land resources in the modern era. Even in the Ottoman Empire, they abandoned this. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, but it is enforced. It is vigorously enforced in Judea and Samaria. So if an Arab decides that he wants to take over a piece of empty state land, for example, the 2 kilometers between 2 Jewish communities in Gush Etzion, what does he have to do? All he has to do is plant something on it. And when he plants something on it and proves that he's using it for agricultural purposes, he gains rights. It can no longer be considered state land. He doesn't gain ownership, but he gains usage rights, and the state loses its ownership of that land. This is, in Hebrew, it's called ibud v'chazaka, which means you are cultivation and possession of land. So this very strange clause in Ottoman land law, you would think, okay, so then why don't the Jews go out and plant equally? Well, I can tell you that in 2012, this is a typo here, I apologize, not 2021, but 2012, the Supreme Court of the State of Israel ruled that the Article 78 of Ottoman land law that grants rights for agricultural use can only benefit Arabs, not Jews. So if I go out and find an empty plot of land outside of the community where I live, and I plant things on it, and the civil administration comes and says, excuse me, you are stealing land. And I say, well, I'm using it for agricultural use. I've planted an orchard here, and so I should get rights to it under Article 78 of Ottoman land law, which is enforced in this part of the world. And the answer will be no, because you are Jewish. You have no rights under Article 78. This is solely for the protection of Arabs. So you tell me, is that apartheid? I believe it is. This is an outrageous system of law that is used to tremendous benefit by the Palestinian Authority in an extremely organized program of creation of a de facto Palestinian state in the areas under Israeli jurisdiction under international law. We have reported on this problem. We have reported on this for 10 years since the launch of the Palestinian Authority's Fayyad plan, announced in 2008, for the creation of a de facto Palestinian state through facts on the ground. That includes not only illegal construction, but also massive exploitation of these particular loopholes in the law that exists and is enforced by Israeli courts. So I'm going to open up now for some questions, just to give you a chance to redirect me here if there's particular things you want me to talk about. I can also, if anyone's interested, send you, for example, like this, whoops, all of the court rulings, all of the Supreme Court decisions, all of the legislative orders, anything that would interest you. Unfortunately, again, none of it has been translated into any other language, so your Hebrew has to be pretty good for all of this. Some of the original Ottoman law was translated as long ago as 1927, and you can see that online. I can send anybody who's interested links to the full Codex of Ottoman land law that is still in use here and nowhere else in the world. So I see that Ruben has raised his hand here for a question. I hope it's still relevant. Can you
I'll
unmute that?
All right, Ruben, you have to click unmute.
Yes.
Go ahead.
We all hear you, Ruben. Let's hear your question.
Go ahead. You have a question?
No.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right. There is a question in the chat from Bernice. Why has no Israeli administration talked about the San Remo resolution to counteract the notion that Israel is occupying in Judea and Samaria?
It's a very good question. We're trying to change that. We've come together with other organizations. I have discussed this with jurists. I have discussed this with diplomats. There is no reason other than the march of history. At the very bedrock, that is the case. And international law, when people talk about international law, they don't realize that there's not really any such thing. International law is made up of a series of treaties. So the San Remo Treaty, because it has never been supplanted by anything else, and it has never been rescinded, is international law. And the United Nations Charter is international law. And the Oslo Accords are international law. All of these things are true. The only thing that is lacking is the political will and the backbone by the Israeli government to point out all of those things and to stand up for its own rights. Rights only work if you're willing to fight for them. And the state of Israel, what we try to do at Regavim is not to replace the government, or to do the government's work, but to encourage and empower the government to actually do all of those things, to stand up for those rights, to bring these issues to bear on international discourse, and not to buckle. Perhaps if the Israeli government would feel that enough people in the public, both within Israel and abroad, support that sort of statement, they would make that sort of statement. I can tell you that the likelihood right now of engaging Jews from around the world on these issues is close to zero. Jews are so concerned about anti-Semitic backlash that they're unwilling to support the state of Israel in any way, and certainly not in these ways. So we're in a very, very dark time right now in terms of our rights. And the more people are educated, I hope, the more that will empower them to speak out, which is why I'm here and why you're here.
I will ask Naomi, in your professional opinion, I don't know how much, in what capacity you deal with the Knesset on a regular basis, but what do you think is the percentage of members of Knesset who are even aware of these Ottoman land laws that are in place, these extremely discriminatory laws? Are they aware? Are they apathetic? Do they know at all?
They are unaware to a shocking degree. We explain these things to them. They're also completely unaware of what's going on out in the field. We try to remedy that by simply taking them on field tours, and we take members of Knesset and ministers out into Judea and Samaria on the average of once a week. We bring not only parliamentarians themselves, but their aides, people on policy committees, journalists, diplomats, anyone who's willing to come out into the field so we can show them, explain the situation, and give them the necessary background so that they can understand not only what should be happening, but what is happening. Many members of Knesset are unaware. They're unaware both of our rights and of the situation as it really is on the ground.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about the tree planting practically? I was talking to you a couple weeks ago about going out and physically planting trees. What happens if I, as a Jew, go out and plant a tree versus what happens if a Palestinian goes out and plants a tree? And what are the resulting effects for years to come? Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, let's put it this way. Under Ottoman land law, if you plant something and it is left there for 30 days, then nobody can do anything about it. Let me rephrase that. If it's left there for 30 days, then you can't just pull it out. You have to go to court to get a court order. So that's what has happened up till now. And the court has essentially sided with the Palestinians, giving them protection under Article 78 of the Ottoman Land Code. If a Jew goes out and plants things on land that doesn't belong to him, on state land, on public land, or on private land, they will immediately have that uprooted, and it doesn't matter how long it was there. They're about to now uproot vineyards and olive orchards in the Shiloh area that have been cultivated by Jewish farmers for over a decade. The court gives a specific date by which any Jewish construction or agricultural project has to be destroyed. Whereas even in cases where the court finds Arab structures or Arab activity on the ground, including agriculture, are illegal, they do not give a date by which the civil administration has to address the problem. And that allows the clock to continue to tick. And by the time it comes back around to court, it's been there for too long and is generally a fact on the ground. This is something that we've gone to court over recently, demanding that the civil administration publicize what its enforcement priorities are, because generally they'll say that what the court says is we don't dictate enforcement priorities to the military. The military will enforce the law according to its own priorities, but nobody ever publicized what those priorities are. So we went to court and we demanded that they that they announce publicly exactly what their enforcement priorities are. And when you see those enforcement priorities, you begin to understand what apartheid looks like. Because at the very, very top of the list of priorities for enforcement is Jewish construction and Jewish agriculture. And at the very bottom of that list of priorities for enforcement is Arab construction and Arab agricultural work on Jewish state land. So we're working against a stacked deck. This has been allowed because the state of Israel has not extended Israeli law to these areas. This is something that needs to be addressed, and I think that we are our own worst enemy at this point.
I mean, I don't know about anyone else, but my blood is boiling. I'm angry. It makes me very angry to hear about this outright discrimination. I mean, so someone asked a question here. Can you make the same presentation or expand it in the Knesset? Have you spoken in the Knesset? Or are there people trying to lobby in public spaces like that?
Yes, well, we don't leave it to chance. What we did was we actually went to the Supreme Court and we filed a lawsuit demanding the repeal of some of these discriminatory laws. It's not enough that the state of Israel has figured out over the last 40 years how to work around the discriminatory apartheid law that bans Jews from private individual Jews from owning property, from buying property in Judea and Samaria. We demanded not only that the military develop a workaround, which they have, which is they create corporations that are based in Judea and Samaria so that corporations can then purchase the land and then individuals can purchase them from Israeli. It's a very convoluted system. And we said, you know what, the statement that you're willing to enforce this law but work around it is so damaging, so backward, so cowardly. So this is not the way a modern state should work. Don't tell me that this is not, this is not sovereign Israeli territory. It doesn't matter. You're creating a situation of apartheid that has to be addressed. And we have gone to the Supreme Court and sued the state of Israel to repeal some of these laws. So yes, we don't need to, we have lobbied the Knesset about this. We have gone to the Ministry of Justice about this. We have gone through the entire bureaucratic hierarchy to try to get these things changed or at least addressed. Most members of Knesset are completely unaware of what this is all about and the intricacies of all of these laws. So we've gone straight to the Supreme Court, and some of these cases are pending, and I hope you'll follow our Facebook page or our website to follow the progress that we're hopefully going to see on getting some of these things repealed or corrected soon.
Someone wrote, sounds like there's intensive psychological work needed in the Knesset. I agree with that.
Yes.
Maybe Naomi, could you write the Regavim and your email and all the contact information in the chat for everyone?
I will also put it up here on the screen, and I will write it in the chat.
Okay,
what's
great.
not here on the screen is my direct email, which is really easy. And I am happy if anybody wants more materials or wants to ask specific questions, if you simply write to me. Although I have to say that if you put a question on any of these platforms in English, it will come to me because I am the entire international division of Regavim. So anything that comes in English or in any other language that isn't Hebrew comes to me. But I'm going to write my,
Excellent. And I'm going to write the Herut Canada information as well for everyone to please follow us, join, become members. We're doing a lot more collaborative projects with amazing people and organizations like Naomi at Regavim. And I will ask you one more thing, Naomi, for my own peace of mind, though I imagine this is probably going to give me the opposite of peace of mind, but in your projection, let's look 50 years down the road from now. How do you think the map of Judea and Samaria is going to change with regard to this war of attrition that's going on?
That's in our hands. I'm an optimist by nature. I work with people who are not only optimists, but they're doers. So we believe that each and every person who's listening right now and every person that you know can help make that change to stop this. What's happening is all in our hands. The state of Israel can end all of this war of attrition, this abuse of the existing legal system. All it needs to do is decide that it wants to do so. There will be international fallout, but I have to tell you, sitting where you guys are sitting, I'm sure you agree, nobody really loves us a lot right now. So they're not going to love us a whole lot less if we do what we need to do to protect ourselves and our future and actually have a land of Israel to pass down to our children and grandchildren. It's what has to be done. It's like pulling off a Band-Aid. It's nasty in the beginning, but it has to be done if you want this wound to heal rather than to fester and to infect the entire body. So now is the time. The time has been now for a long time, but the other side, the forces that are working against the future of the state of Israel and the future of any Jewish future for Judea and Samaria and for the integrity of the Jewish state as a whole, are gaining force. They're gaining support by repeating lies and half-truths and misinformation for decades. They are making tremendous headway. And we have to fight that with facts, with law, and with full support for what is right and what is true.
Right. I will say that I think we see that the international world explodes in anger, almost like a child having a temper tantrum for a while when we do something to assert our rights. You know, the most recent example that the international community latched onto was Sheikh Jarrah, where we're evicting, illegal squatters on Jewish land. And yes, there was like a month or two where the whole international community lost their minds, and now it's kind of been forgotten, and it's still being kind of absolved in the court system. So yes, I think you're right. We have to rip it off like a Band-Aid. People will freak out and there will be backlash, but they will ultimately forget and then people will move on, because I think it helps that it's being done through the court system as well. When it's not just militarily enforced and it's through the court system, it kind of calms people down. But Dr. Walsky said, how do we fight the general smear of apartheid without cause? I think without being cheesy, what's the call to action, right? What do you want us to do after tonight's talk? Where should we go? What should we do?
Well, the first thing that you can do is go onto our website or our Facebook page, find the posts about articles, Regulation 40 of and our case against the Israeli government, and Article 78. I also wrote a few op-eds on this topic, time to do away with legislated racism, various things like that. Share it widely. People need to know that there is legislated anti-Jewish racism that is being enforced upon us, and it is not the other way around. Lauren, you mentioned also the Sheikh Jarrah issue. I gave a lengthy webinar to, of all things, a group in Finland about the Sheikh Jarrah issue. This is another case of clear anti-Semitism. If the owners of these properties had been Arabs and the renters Jews, they would have been out of there and or in prison immediately. But the state of Israel is now bending over backwards. The courts have suggested an outrageously generous compromise, quote unquote, that would allow everyone to back off and continue. The renters could continue living there with protected status for 3 generations, paying an extremely symbolic rent, but simply admitting that the rightful owners are the rightful owners. The Palestinian Authority and the international community are forbidding these renters from accepting Israel's compromise. So it hasn't been resolved. But again, this is A, a blood libel, and B, anti-Semitic in the incredibly one-sided enforcement of the law. Regavim stands for, calls for, works for equal and universal enforcement of the law, even the laws that we have that are incredibly lacking and in so many ways backward. First, start by enforcing those equally and universally, and we will avoid much of the trouble that we're having. Other than that, once that happens, the state of Israel will be able to actually get a handle on updating these laws, changing these laws, and hopefully extending Israeli law, modern, Western, democratic Israeli law, to all areas under its jurisdiction. Leaving aside the question of sovereignty, not sovereignty, the law as it exists right now is damaging the chances for peace of any kind in this area.
Well, thank you so much, Naomi. I wish we could get you into every high school, every university, every parliament meeting in every country, especially here in Israel. I just wish we could multiply you and put you everywhere to tell people this, because I don't know about anyone else, but I'm fuming. I'm pumped. I'm ready to get up and do something about this, you know? I want to go speak to people and tell them and explain to them about Ottoman land law. I mean, how can you not, right? It's like putting a cattle prod up your tuchus. I'm ready to go. So I hope everyone else really
it is infuriating. It is infuriating. But the one thing that I will say is I want to be very, very clear about, and that is there has to be law. We don't want to live in a place where there is no law, and we don't want to live in a place where people take the law in their own hands or decide for themselves that the law is not relevant and therefore doesn't need to be obeyed. We don't want chaos. We don't want unending conflict. We don't want bloodshed. We want an orderly legal system that protects the Zionist vision and the rights of the Jewish people in its homeland. That's what we're after.
Right, right. Thank you so much for being here. That was a fantastic presentation. It was so enlightening. I hope everyone learned something. How could you not, right? I mean, I don't think anyone knew much of this before, but thank you so much for being here. We'll definitely have you back. Guys, everyone who came, thank you so much for attending this Herut Canada Regavim presentation with our speaker, Naomi Kahn. She's amazing. Stay tuned for more Herut Canada presentations, and please feel free to contact me, Herut Canada, Naomi, Regavim. You can find the information in the chat there, or you can Google us and find us online, and we'll answer any questions that weren't answered here. Thank you guys all so much. Naomi, thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.